How does a 19-year-old kid vanish off the face of the earth while he's on the phone with his father? One moment, Brandon Swanson was describing where he'd crashed his car, and the next, the line went silent. Not dead, no. The phone call was still going on, but Brandon, it seems, was yanked out of existence while he was in the middle of talking. In virtually flat farmland, where he could see town lights in every direction, Brandon disappeared. And despite this being Minnesota's most extensive search in its history, not a trace of Brandon's ever been found. Not a shoe, not the phone, just nothing. This is the case of Brandon Swanson, Minnesota's most perplexing mystery. Let's get into it. Brandon Swanson graduated from Marshall High School in the small town of Marshall, Minnesota in 2007 and attended college just 30 minutes away from his hometown in 2008 at Minnesota West Technical College. He'd applied for a one-year course at the college to study wind turbine technology, which up until researching this case was a field that I never even knew existed. It's fascinating stuff though. According to his parents, Brian and Annette Swanson, Brandon was a chill, everyday sort of guy. No drugs, no wild parties, and he'd never caused any trouble. Just a good, well-rounded kid. Marshall lies in the greater Lynd County. It's not a large county by any means, but it's almost completely made up of farmland and a handful of very small towns. This is an important factor to understand going forward. You see, Brandon knew the area, and he knew it well. He'd grown up there after all, but that county's made up with a spider web of little side roads that lead to tucked-away farms and campsites, shortcuts to the numerous different towns, and sometimes to absolutely nowhere. Route 68 is the main highway across the county, and had Brandon taken it, we probably wouldn't be having this conversation today. With that said, Brandon's first academic year went well. The last day was on May the 14th, and he ended off his year by attending some parties before heading home that evening. This should kind of give you an idea of how chill this guy was. Plenty of other kids were getting absolutely plastered and opting to drive home the next day after their hangovers wore off. Hey, what did you expect? It's college. Brandon, on the other hand, was planning on having a drink at each of the get-togethers that he was invited to just to make an appearance and to then head home. Before you raise your eyebrows that he was planning on driving at night after drinking, I need to remind everyone that the drive was only 30 minutes and he'd had approximately 2 beers at each of the 2 parties he attended. Now, that does put him over the limit, not to mention that he was 19 and therefore too young to drink in the US, but it's not like he was chugging the tequilas, not even close. Everyone around Brandon that night reported that he wasn't even tipsy when he left at midnight. Had he taken Route 68, he should have been home by 1 o'clock in the morning. But Brandon didn't take 68. He took a shortcut that he was familiar with, probably to avoid getting caught by police for underage drinking and driving. Some 30 minutes after he left, he called his parents to inform them that he'd driven his car into a ditch. Brian Swanson immediately confirmed that his son was unharmed. After making sure that Brandon was all right, they discussed his location and the condition of the car. Getting the car out of the ditch would have to wait till morning, but the damage didn't seem too severe. It just wasn't budging. After Brandon told his father that he was between Lynd and Marshall, Lynd is an equally small town just 7 miles southwest of Marshall. Brian and Annette knew the road well. They'd driven it themselves a few times before, so they put on their coats and headed off into the night to fetch their son. But when they reached the road where Brandon had said he was, there was no sign of him or his car. They drove up and down that road multiple times, flashing their headlights. Brandon was on the phone with his father throughout this confusing search, but from his side of the line, he couldn't see their lights either. After nearly an hour of fruitless searching, both Brandon and his father were becoming increasingly frustrated. So Brandon said to his father that he just walked to Lynd. If he was right about where he was, then he'd only have to walk 2 or 3 miles. They agreed that Brandon would meet Brian at the Linwood Lounge, a place that everyone in Lynd and the surrounding town were familiar with. Brian dropped Annette off back home and headed off to Lynd to pick up his son. Throughout this, the two of them continued to call each other back and forth. Brandon described his surroundings quite well to his father. He could see the town lights and was walking through a farm field that had a few fences that he needed to climb over, and he could hear running water, which would put Brandon outside of Lynd somewhere. Lynd has 2 rivers running around either side of it. The Redwood River runs through the western side of town, and the 3 Mile Creek runs a few miles farther west, so he was definitely in the general area. At 3:30 a.m., with Brian already at the lounge and still on the phone with his son, Brandon suddenly yelled, "Oh, crap!" and the line went silent. Well, actually, he yelled another profanity, but I don't want to anger the YouTube overlords and get demonetized. But he shouted something along the line of, "Oh, sheiks," if you catch my drift. Now, the line didn't go dead. Everything just went silent. Whatever had happened to Brandon in that second, he was either no longer holding the phone or he was incapable of speaking. Brian tried to elicit a response from him, but after several minutes of getting nothing, he ended the call and tried to call back, but the phone just kept ringing, over and over again. Brian called Annette, who took her own car and headed over to Lynd. Together they scoured every back road, main road, and dirt path they could, flashing their lights, honking their horns, and continuously trying to call Brandon. But Brandon's phone just kept ringing. At 6:30 that morning, they went to the police for help. Now, both Brandon's parents and the police suspected that Brandon had fallen or stepped in a ditch while he was on the phone with his father. He was walking through farmland, so the ground was certainly rugged enough for something like that to happen. Maybe he knocked his head or tumbled into a creek, something along those lines. At first, the police station was unwilling to launch a search. You know the age-old line. Brandon was 18, legally an adult, and therefore they were under no obligation to file a report for 24 hours. Luckily, this is a small community, and Brian was on the phone with the sheriff before the sun was fully up. And thankfully, the sheriff wasn't a lazy idiot. Obviously, the circumstances, Brandon's shout of surprise, and the fact that his car had been totaled were all concerning events. Outside of a bad fall, Brandon could very well have hit his head when his car went into a ditch. Head injury was very likely, no matter which scenario you looked at. While the first patrol cars went out, they pulled up the cell phone records and found his car. And here's where the weirdness dials up a notch. Brandon wasn't anywhere near Lynd. He'd gone into the ditch just a few miles after leaving the party on a completely different road that he told his father he was on. His phone pinged 19 miles away from his home, close to the crash site. After leaving the party, Brandon turned right, not left like he was supposed to, sending him off in a southeastern direction, not straight down west like he thought he was going. When he crashed the car, he headed back towards the town of Canby, where his college was, traveling north on foot while he thought he was going south. Brandon was obviously not where he thought he was at all, not even close. He was nearly 20 miles away from where his parents were looking for him. No wonder they couldn't see each other. But had Brandon continued his path, he would have reached the nearest town, Taunton, long before daylight. Actually, he couldn't have missed Taunton's lights in the dark. The town had high-grain storage units with red beacons on them that shone brightly enough for him to see, yet he walked the other way. Now, the natural assumption would be that Brandon was much more intoxicated than he seemed. He was on the shorter side and of a slight build, so even if he just had 4 beers, that could definitely have affected him more than the average-sized guy. His friends, who were almost all inebriated, likely misjudged the situation. So yes, Brandon getting lost after having more to drink than he probably should have is a perfectly reasonable assumption to make. Stumbling and seriously hurting himself, even to the point of being deceased out there, is also very likely. So then, where was he? Unconscious or dead? His phone was still ringing, and by the afternoon, people were actively searching in every direction from where his car was located. When foot searchers came up with nothing, dogs were brought in. They tracked him well enough for a mile through farmland, but when they reached a gravel road, they lost his scent. Before you go thinking that Brandon was picked up by someone, gravel isn't great at holding on to scents. The dust, rocks, and dirt get kicked around by passing cars so much that it disperses the smell. But Brandon's tracks didn't continue on the other side of the road either. So he was either picked up by someone or he continued walking on the path on foot. Yet he never mentioned it to his father on the phone. They picked up his scent again, another mile away from the gravel road. Again, Brandon seemed to be headed towards nowhere. Taunton, the closest town whose lights he would have seen from his car, was now behind him. If it's sounding like he was wandering aimlessly, he absolutely was. There's no clear path or direction that Brandon was taking at all. The path that the dogs were following crossed another river, called Yellow Medicine River. And for a moment, searchers thought that this must be where Brandon had fallen into. It had to be the running water he was hearing, and that river was unusually high that time of year. But apparently, Brandon didn't fall in. He crossed the river and got out the other side, where the dogs picked up his trail again, this time heading into a privately owned piece of land with an abandoned farmhouse on it. Every single one of the county's available policemen were actively searching. They had a helicopter in the air, dogs, and men on horseback. By day 2, when the tracks led to the farmhouse, every square inch of the surrounding land was being searched by hundreds of people. Brandon's phone had stopped ringing the day before, presumably due to its battery running out. Yellow Medicine River was still a worry for searchers, even though the dogs indicated that he'd walked out the other side. They submerged gates and mesh catchment nets at intervals stretching for miles downstream, that they pulled up every few hours to check if any of Brandon's possessions had been caught. People were walking the banks and examining branches for any signs of clothing, shoes, anything that could have belonged to Brandon. But they found nothing. By the end of the 6th day, search cadaver dogs were brought in, but they didn't detect a thing either. Officially, police pulled back their search efforts on day 6, but that doesn't mean that searching stopped. Several organizations stepped in, hundreds of volunteers, and even more horseback searchers commenced. After a month of fruitless searching, there was still no sign of Brandon. But for the next few years, the Swanson family continued to fund new searches in hopes of finding their son's body. To drive home how strange this is, that area really isn't that large. Almost every square inch is taken up by farmland that farmers and their employees are walking in every single day. There are hundreds of little roads and offshoots, almost all leading to somewhere, and people were crawling over every single one of them and the fields that ran beside them. If he was lying dead out there, the cadaver dogs would have found him. All in all, a 140 square mile stretch was searched, or at least it would have been. While most farmers willingly opened their gates for the searchers, those who had cattle wouldn't do it without search warrants. This wasn't because they were jerks. The dogs used in the searches were unfamiliar with cows, and if the canines scared them, they could panic and stampede, leading to stress and even broken bones. Once the search warrants came through, the farmers had no problems letting the searchers in, but a fair number of farms was skipped over because warrants weren't issued. To date, this is one of the most extensive and long-running searches in American history, with several major parties going out each year. It's almost certain that Brandon didn't fall into any river. His body would have washed ashore the day after he'd fallen in, probably sooner. Besides, the dogs tracking him to the empty farmhouse indicated that he had made it across in one piece. Now we get to the theories. If the dogs are to be believed, then Brandon died or disappeared while on dry land. But he never indicated to his father that he was walking through a river at any point during their calls, and he was being pretty descriptive about what was going on around him, leading many people to believe that he saw something or that someone was coming toward him when he dropped the phone. Whatever it was ensued in a chase, causing Brandon to run over a river to lose his pursuers. But Brian didn't hear any yelling, voices, gunshots, or anything to indicate that Brandon had run into people. So then, what about the animals? It couldn't have been those either. The most dangerous predators there are the coyotes. The other theory is that Brandon fell, and while unconscious, a farmer accidentally ran over him with a tractor. This is highly unlikely. It was early spring, and therefore nothing is being harvested and all the plantings were done already. So no human attacked him, certainly not an animal, because that would have been heard over the phone. But most feel that he dropped the phone to run away from something, because he was desperate enough to wade through ice-cold spring water in a pretty choppy river that he definitely crossed over. I don't agree with this assessment at all. There is no definitive direction that Brandon seemed to be following. Even someone running from something isn't going to go in several different directions. To me, his path screams disorientation. He was going all over the place, never sticking to any specific direction for long, leaving us only with the abandoned farm where his scent stopped. That farm's been searched through with a fine-tooth comb. Brandon isn't there. He was there at some point, sure, but he definitely didn't die there. Nobody owned that farm, so no one would have removed his body to cover up a crime, and the cadaver dogs didn't pick up anything there either. Now, a lot of people are hung up about Brandon taking the wrong road in the first place. Like I said, he was way off course. The road he took wouldn't have led him home, not even close. But we have to admit that he was drinking. It's perfectly reasonable that he had a little too much, leading him to getting turned around and to driving his car into the ditch. Couple that with a probable head injury, well, it doesn't matter how sober or incoherent he sounded over the phone unless we could have examined him. We have to expect the worst, that Brandon was in fact confused and completely lost. He either fell and got injured enough that he died where he got injured, or else aliens zipped him up to outer space. like so many people seem to believe. But excuse me if I don't take the abduction route too seriously, because that's the biggest mystery here. It's where on earth his remains are. The terrain is rough, sure, but these aren't the dense woods, filled with scavengers and landslides for Pete's sake. It's farmland, flat farmland, that's been searched through more than any other missing persons case in the state of Minnesota and most of the U.S. for that matter. At least something good came out of this terrible disappearance. Brandon's Law was introduced in almost every state in the U.S. It's thanks to Brandon that police must open a report and search for missing people no matter how old they are or for how long they've been missing. Once a concern is raised, authorities are obligated to search for the missing person immediately. Personally, I think Brandon suffered a head injury and stumbled into some hidden away crevice where he passed away, or fell into a well that's been there for 100 years and people just missed it in their searches because it's not marked on any map. It wouldn't be the first time something like it's happened, and if Brandon just stayed with his car and waited a few hours for daylight, then we wouldn't be talking about this at all today. But for now, the question falls onto you, the viewers. What happened here, and why has there never been anything of Brandon found? Not a shred of clothing, no cell phone, and no body. Nothing. Because I'm stumped. Unless you think it's aliens, please let me know in the comments below. And while you're at it, don't forget to like and subscribe. I'll catch you on the next one. Cheers.